Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Jacobin Talks. My name is Bhaskar Sunkara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine, and we've been doing these Jacobin Talks since about April with the help of our video producer, Kale Brooks, and a host of great contributors. So, just to briefly introduce what we're trying to do with the talks. We obviously started Jackman 10 years ago. We're trying to now do a little bit more video and audio. We have big things planned next year. This is kind of the soft pilot run, but everything we're going to be doing is going to be available free of charge. So our only ask for you is just to press like and subscribe to show your support for the channel that way. Tomorrow we have another edition of Weekends, like we do every Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern with Anna and Nando. And our guest is Adolph Reed. They'll be, I guess, previewing a little bit of the election on Tuesday, which I guess you already knew. The election's on Tuesday. On Monday, we'll have a conversation with Matt Karp. I think I'll probably do that myself. And Karp, in addition to being a historian of the 19th century and a contemporary commentator on politics, is among us far left socialist Bernie Bros, probably the person I know who's most invested in the horse race aspect of what's going on. So he's been examining the polling. He's been looking at a lot of important questions. I guess the most salient from a political stance is, can Biden overcome the de-alignment of the Democratic Party from its formerly working class base that we've seen in recent years? What will the Biden coalition look like? I mean, from my less informed perspective, it seems to me that has been able to make some real gains among groups that voted for Obama in 2012, 2016, or 2008 and 2012, but didn't vote for Clinton in 2016, while at the same time dominating wealthier suburbs. So I myself had bet all of $250 on a Biden victory. And I'm thinking about putting another like 100 down on Kamala Harris as VP. So I'm feeling pretty good about that outcome. I'm now invested in it. So if anyone tells you that, again, the ultra leftists at Jacobin don't want Biden to win, I would just say that it's our institutional stance to never make an endorsement in an election. But I myself am not only morally committed to the defeat of Donald Trump, I now have given myself a vested material interest in this happening. So, mind you, I probably just set myself up for prosecution in some sense. I'm not quite sure. But we'll talk with Matt Karp about what's going to happen and its wider political significance. Then on Wednesday, we're going to have another chat, a follow-up chat after the election with Vivek Chibber and Ariella Thornhill, two great friends of Jacobin, who will be discussing whatever the outcome is, or even if it's indeterminate, what it means for the socialist left going forward. Because obviously our politics is not just about elections every 2 years, every 4 years. Our politics are about building a long-term opposition movement, building resistance to capital, and building some sort of alternative to capitalism. So on that note, I'll introduce our guest for this evening. It's my friend and collaborator, David Sirota. David is now an editor-at-large at Jacobin. He's the founder of the Daily Poster, which has been doing really incredible investigative content. I think people have gotten so used to it being around, they forget that David and a handful of people like Andrew Perez and others just founded it a few months ago. So it's already, they're turning out with a very small group of people involved, maybe like 4 or 5 pieces some weeks. So David has been quite busy. And obviously, David was also involved in the 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign. So what we'll do is have a little conversation. We'll talk a little bit about the Sanders campaign and what happened, what we should take as far as lessons from the campaign. We'll talk a bit. I want to ask him a bit about, journalism and writing and his own work. We normally don't really delve into that stuff, but I think David has some really interesting insights. And finally, we'll take some of your questions. So please press like, press subscribe, leave your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But thank you for joining us, David. I know you had a busy day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I guess to start with, there's been a lot of news in the past week about Bernie apparently angling for labor secretary. I don't want to inflate it because it was like a Politico piece and everything's in Politico.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure, first of all, how much to take it at face value. But assuming it is true, I'm just wondering about your what do you think about the idea? And first of all, whether Biden would go for it, but also what do you think about the idea? I had my own somewhat controversial take on the idea, but I'll let you go first.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a terrible idea. I think people don't really fully understand why that office is so important and so powerful. I think people think of the Labor Department as OSHA and workplace safety and that kind of enforcement, which is certainly important. But it also has a huge amount of power over Wall Street that a lot of people don't really know about. Essentially, the Labor Department oversees a large part of the retirement system, such as it is in the United States, through 401k plans, private pensions, and the like. And Wall Street, obviously, that's a huge piece of its business. And so the labor secretary has at his or her disposal an enormous amount of power to really take on Wall Street. So in that sense, I think, Bernie Sanders becoming labor secretary would be enormously important if that power was used. Now, of course, the flip side is that the people who make those appointments certainly know that power exists in that office. And my guess would be that would be one of the reasons why it would be harder for somebody like Bernie Sanders to get appointed to that position, because those people still have a lot of power, and they would have a lot of power in a Joe Biden administration. And I'm not necessarily sure that Joe Biden would override them and put Bernie Sanders into a position like that. And there's also the idea that he could be put into a position like that in a way where he is expected to not cross certain lines. And that's not to say that Bernie would necessarily agree to that and not and agree to a lack of autonomy, but it is in a sense implicit that the cabinet secretaries serve at the pleasure of the president and have to do what the president wants. So I guess the way to think about it is that if Joe Biden puts Bernie Sanders in as labor secretary, and we presume that Bernie Sanders, and I think the correct presumption is that Bernie Sanders would not agree to just, go there and essentially sell out, then it's a signal that Joe Biden is serious about taking on corporate power. I mean, if Bernie Sanders isn't named labor secretary and somebody who's much more of a corporate ally is put in that position, I think that'll be another signal. So I don't want to speculate on which way I think it'll go or predict which way I think it'll go. I just think, that's really what's at stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my own view is that Bernie Sanders' particular role is basically irreplaceable as someone who can galvanize some sort of socialist poll or democratic socialist poll that they can say, we stand for Medicare for all, we want a Green New Deal. We also obviously want to see Trump defeated, but when Biden's in office, we need to pressure and hold some sort of leverage over him. And obviously beyond that, just the usual thing he does using his bully pulpit in the Senate to unite not only the small handful of people who are actually on the left together, but also a lot of other people he's able to rope in. People underestimate how skilled of a politician is. I mean, Bernie managed to get Kamala Harris to sign on to a Medicare for all bill, which I think tells you something there. So obviously, I mean, I guess my kind of view is that his role, a lot of people left of center could be good labor secretaries. Bernie Sanders has a particular role that we don't necessarily want muzzled by the administration. I don't even mean muzzled in a bad way, because I've been critical of Biden on a million things, but expecting someone in your own cabinet to toe the administration line is just kind of how it's done in the U.S. You know, it's just
Yeah, and I think your concern is fair. I mean, I think that's your concern is certainly fair in the sense that if Biden is president, there's definitely going to be a need for leaders in Congress who are willing to push him, and I think Bernie will be one of those leaders.
hmm So, in an earlier interview that you did with us, I think this was actually probably on the weekends show with Anna and our late friend Michael Brooks. Um, you said that you thought Bernie had been a bit too easy on Joe because he liked him. And also, I guess in our kind of print, which I actually recommend everyone check out, because we actually didn't. Um, um, there's that, but there's also I think a interview in our oral history in that last print issue of Jacobin that I really recommend everyone check out, because there was people from across the campaign kind of um, in dialogue with each other, even though they were initially separate interviews. But you said that Bernie had been a bit too easy on Joe because he liked him. I kind of, from the outside, almost thought that it was just a tactic, like Bernie saying, "Hey, I'm in the club," or "Hey, look at me, Democratic voter." Who the average Democratic voter doesn't really hate the Democratic establishment the way maybe me or you hate the Democratic establishment. Like my parents, in the end, probably had Bernie as their first choice, but they also really liked Biden, and they also, were okay with Kamala Harris and didn't really think too negatively of anyone in the field. And I thought that maybe Bernie was just trying to signal that he's not this crazy radical. He's been in the Senate for a long time, that he has relationships, that he had a good relationship with Barack Obama and whatever else for the sake of the primary. But you seem to paint it as, an actual friendship, or an actual kind of personal kind of feeling that Bernie had for Biden. And I guess this is a long-winded way of getting to. Do you think that this relative chumminess um, has paid off for the Sanders agenda in any way, or will it pay off, or in other words, is there an alternate universe where Sanders is more confrontational and he gets more gains, or are we just dealing with the fact that we lost the primary and now we're dealing with the consequences of not getting our agenda in?
Well, I think that Bernie does have a lot of affinity personally for Joe Biden. I mean, I don't think they're like pals. I just think he generally likes him. I think that both, I think Biden has moved in some ways, certainly from his agenda from the 1990s even into the 2000s. I mean, I think Joe Biden, at least on paper, his agenda is fairly progressive. I still think it's more conservative in a lot of ways than where the general population is if you just put it up against polls. But it's certainly more progressive than where Joe Biden was. Is that a reflection of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren kind of making common cause with Joe Biden? I don't know. I mean, the country has moved, and Joe Biden is a thumb in the wind politician in a lot of ways, a standard politician. It's not really an insult to him in the sense that he's like many other politicians in that way. And so, was that because Bernie and Elizabeth Warren have sort of courted Joe Biden? It's hard to say. I think that ultimately, though, that Joe Biden will need to be pushed. And these senators, whether Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or anybody else, are going to have to wake up every day and look in the mirror and ask themselves whether their behavior is governed by their desire to be liked by the new Democratic president, assuming that he wins, or whether they're operating on behalf of what they know to be the right thing to do. And those things come into tension. Uh, you know, we have not lived through, at least in my lifetime, a situation in which the base of the Democratic Party, or certainly the Democratic Party's lawmakers and advocacy groups, have been willing to seriously challenge a Democratic president and push a Democratic president. That just hasn't been a part of our politics probably since the Vietnam War. And perhaps that's because of what happened in 1968, and that was seen as a disaster, and sort of the activists pushed so hard that the convention happened and the like. And we can talk about that history some other time. But the point is that I do think we're moving into potentially an era that will be different, in that the base of the Democratic Party, if Biden wins, will have a president that not a lot of people love in the way that they loved Barack Obama, or even Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton first became president. I mean, I remember that. Maybe I'm dating myself and telling you how old I am, but like, I remember how excited people were. Not just that George H.W. Bush lost, but that Bill Clinton was becoming president, first boomer president, and all that. And so the point is that there hasn't been a moment in my lifetime where the base of the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party's representation in the Congress has been willing to really seriously push a Democratic president. I mean, certainly 2009, 2010, in my view, was a disaster in that the Democrats just absolutely, totally deferred to Barack Obama as he used his power largely to prop up the power of the insurance industry and reinflate Wall Street. That's what happened. And I know people don't like to hear that that's what happened, but that is literally what happened. And part of the reason that happened was because the Democrats in the Congress simply weren't willing to push him. And the activist base of the Democratic Party wasn't willing to push him in any real way. I think that's different now. And that's why I think when you hear Bernie Sanders talk about how Joe Biden could be the next FDR, I mean, half of my response to that is to eye roll because I know who Joe Biden is. But my other half of my brain interprets that as this is an actual political moment. Whether it's Joe Biden, doesn't really matter that it's Joe Biden, is that this is a political moment where the environment is much different than 2009 and 2010, where the party's base and more of the party's representation in Congress is really willing to have a direct confrontation with Joe Biden if he is president. Now, we will see if that happens. I certainly think the conditions are better than they were for that kind of thing to happen than it was in 2009 and 2010. And I certainly think if that is the case, that is an ideal kind of situation for real legislative change to happen. I think you could argue that that's what happened in the 1960s with the Kennedy administration, even the Johnson administration, that there was a base of the party, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, with people in Congress who were supportive of that, to demand that the Democratic demands of a Democratic president. And I think that is, when I think about this election, which has been a depressing elections season, that's the thing I think about as an ideal outcome, an active, engaged base that doesn't have a personal love of the, sort of kids at the Beatles show screaming fandom love of a Democratic president, motivated by principle, motivated by an agenda, with representatives in Congress who are also motivated by that agenda.
Right. So I guess often when I hear the FDR comparison, I just think it's used not just by Sanders, but I remember there was that Time cover when Barack Obama got elected that had him dressed as
Yep.
FDR. There was similar writing in The Nation about our coming New Deal, and a lot of it just focused on the fact that the recession and the crisis at that moment was so severe that Obama would have to come in and do something, right? He would have to break with neoliberalism, and I think now a lot of the wishful thinking is Biden will have to do something just because of coronavirus. But it seems to me that I'm a bit worried because when we think about the 30s, even the 60s too, but let's say the 30s, you had not only a country with fairly significant numbers of communists and socialists organized, but you had a massive labor unrest. And years before that, you had a mass movements of the unemployed, you had the bonus army. It just was a very different environment. Whereas it seems to me, and we can kind of get to prognosis later about what we're kind of expecting from Tuesday. But it seems to me that if Biden wins, in large part, it'll be a vindication of Joe Biden pursuing his strategy, which is to be all things to all people, to win over wealthier voters in suburbs, to win over a Democratic base that is now incorporating very significant numbers of Republican defectors, and do all sorts of other things that, to be honest, I'll be glad that Trump is out of office. However, it's done. But it seems to me that social base is not really a social base. It's going to be clamoring for radical change as opposed to return to normal. And it seems to me that even among working class people in the Democratic Party coalition, a lot of these people just want a return to the basics, return to normal, and kind of an end to some of this chaos and polarization and whatever else. And that makes me kind of pessimistic. But it sounds like maybe you're. I normally think of me as more optimistic than you, but it sounds like maybe you're slightly more optimistic.
No, I mean, yes, I mean, like you're describing the what I've called the brunch liberals. That people just want to go back to brunch. They just want things to go back to quote unquote normal, and I think that's a real thing. And there's an entire cable TV industry that's designed to make people think that and feel that way. I mean, that was MSNBC's ideology. Everything's fine. Barack Obama's president. The only real problem in the country is Mitch McConnell, and let's just trust the president. Like I just basically described to you 10 years of MSNBC programming. So I have no doubt that will be the same kind of message that will come from the power elite, and if Biden wins. But I also think that both the crises that we face are so profound and so in our face that the spin for deference, the push for deference, will butt up against fire tornadoes burning communities, and a pandemic ripping through cities, and right. I mean, just like it's like there's only so much bullshit that can cover over the real crises happening in the world. And so, and on top of that, I do think there are more potentially people being elected into a Democratic Congress, hopefully Democratic Congress, that do not feel the kind of loyalty that the new members of Congress felt to Obama, that new members of Congress now may feel towards Joe Biden. And I think that dynamic offers more of a chance of confrontation and pushing. I also think, frankly, the intellectual architecture and infrastructure of the left is better organized than it was 10, 11, 12 years ago. You see Demand Progress, the Revolving Door Project, working to try to organize some pressure about, for instance, Joe Biden's potential transition team, putting people in places in these jobs. I just think it's certainly not enough, and it's certainly not where the left was when FDR was coming into power, but it's also more than where the left was when Bill Clinton came into power, and when Barack Obama came into power. And so that gives me some hope. And the last thing I'll say is that what also gives me hope is that we've seen that politics can move rather quickly in times of crisis. That as the quote that Bernie always quotes, the Mandela quote, it's always impossible until it is done. I think we've seen even in the last few months that things that seem impossible in theory, when a crisis hits, they become extremely possible very quickly. I mean, I wasn't a fan of for instance, the CARES Act, but Congress passed in a very, very quick, at a very quick pace, a massive amount of emergency spending. Now, too much of that spending went to corporations, but a certain significant portion of that went to those to boost unemployment benefits. That was a previously unheard of idea or possibility before the crisis. And I think we are now living in a constant crisis. So I think things can change very quickly. By the way, very quickly for the good, and of course, very quickly for the bad.
Yeah, and I think even when we're assessing what happened with the two Sanders campaigns, we sometimes at Jackman just refer to as kind of one campaign because that's what it felt like, a long 5 year campaign. Like something happened there. There was too many people mobilized into it. There was too many distinct demands that are still not fully co-opted by the mainstream. Demands for Medicare for all, which now has majority support. Green New Deal, which has very close to majority support. Basic demands for good union jobs, and so on that are widely popular but don't have this kind of mainstream support. And that experience is there. DSA, I mean, as anyone who watches this channel knows, I'm quite critical of some aspects of DSA. I think it needs to be an organization. I say this as a member for 13, 14 years of DSA. It needs to be an organization more deeply implanted into working class life in the US, but it's definitely a start. And by the end of the year, we might have 100,000 people in DSA. When Barack Obama was elected president, I think we had 5 or 6 thousand people in DSA. I mean, all those things, Justice Democrats didn't exist. We didn't have AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida in office. I mean, I think all these things matter to some degree, and I think it makes possible, at least, that there can be some sort of coherent pull of opposition. And when I think about the early Obama years and even uh, single payer getting extended mention in the mainstream news, it was often Anthony Weiner, being on MSNBC, the only one who would mention single payer. I don't know if anyone remembers some of Anthony Weiner's impassioned appeals for single payer healthcare, and Dennis Kucinich being the best we could get on the debate stage and whatever else. We are in a very different um, environment, which gives me some hope. What I'm wondering, David, is do you feel some of the tensions that I feel between, I guess, I'm seeing a lot of the approach of Bernie and a lot of his co-thinkers as being, all right, we need to get Trump out of office. We need to do whatever we can to get Biden elected. And for Bernie, that means campaigning, canvassing, and whatnot. I understand where he's coming from. I certainly understand the necessity and the urgency of getting someone as destructive as Donald Trump out of office. But do you see a potential danger between the blurring of opposition with kind of a neutered coalition? In other words, I worry that right now Bidenism will be strong enough to beat Trump just because of how inept and destructive Trump is and how hated he is by so many Americans. Um, but I worry that Biden and the Democratic Party establishment won't be able to defeat Trumpism in the long term. And there's a risk of throwing all your chips in as kind of Bernie crats into the Bidenism train just to ensure that one, Trump will be defeated, and two, that any potential Biden defeat isn't really blamed on Bernie Sanders the way they tried to blame 2016 on Bernie. Then also not providing this anti-establishment energy on the left. I worry that in 2022, if the Biden administration is stalled out, will these Bernie crowds just be complicit in whatever Biden's doing, and will that anti-establishment energy either turn into young people being apathetic, and then a minority of people kind of being turned to the far for the populist right? And I wonder whether the next Trump we'll get in 2028 is going to be all the more powerful and actually a competent politician, an American Modi or an American Bolsonaro that's really, really dangerous. So, again, not a particularly pointed question, but I'm just wondering how you're weighing these, thinking about coalition versus confrontation, um, and and maybe not so stark an economy I just laid out.
I think your concerns are right. I think that, I mean, my basic thesis is that if 2021 and 2022 under a new Democratic president is 2009 and 2010, then we're going to get a midterm election like 2010, which was a disaster. And ultimately, we will get, if that sort of trajectory continues, we would get another Donald Trump, but worse, a smarter Donald Trump. I think it's pretty simple to my mind, which is that if you don't deliver for working people will seek an alternative on the right. And the right offers a very cogent and cohesive, if absurd and discredited argument, a political argument about to working people about why their worldview is better. And if a left of center government does not deliver for working people, then right wing fascists will seize power. But we have seen that over and over and again through history. And I think the thing that isn't well understood about the New Deal is that the New Deal in the 1930s, it was a moral imperative for a country that was in such an economic crisis, which is to say that the policies themselves were needed in order to deliver essentially necessity benefits, survival benefits for people and for the economy. But in delivering those benefits, I think the argument can be made that the New Deal helped stave off the rise of fascism in this country. That in delivering for working people, it helped lessen the political agency of fascist political forces that wanted to get elected against FDR and against the Democrats. So I think that we have to see a similar New Deal style agenda today as both a moral imperative. People need health care during a pandemic, for example, just because that's the morally right thing to do. But there's also a political imperative that if you don't deliver health care to people during a pandemic, if you allow people to basically starve as billionaires get richer and richer, if you don't do anything to rescue communities because of the climate crisis, then fascist forces in this country will have a political opening to make their argument about how they will deliver. And so we have to understand the political utility of the moral agenda that we are pushing.
Yeah, I think essentially what you're saying in regards to the next 4 years is if these Bernie-crats are successful in pushing Biden to actually get something done, that in itself will open up future political possibilities, and it'll also prevent the rise of this right.
Right. I mean, it won't be
But
done.
obviously, yeah,
He will not be delivering, and they will not be pushing him to deliver in spite of his and the Democratic Party's political prospects. They will be pushing him to deliver in order to help the Democratic Party's political prospects, along with in order to deliver real gains, real material gains for working people. It's not a conflict of interest, is what I'm saying. It's an alignment of interests.
right, right. So
The only interest that it doesn't align with are corporate interests,
but
which have a
also
lot of power in the Democratic Party.
yeah, exactly. They have a lot of power in the Democratic Party, and also have this new voter base, this transforming voter base, the Democratic Party. And Biden, I think, has been able to align some of these trade-offs because of how popular he is among some working class Americans of all races, but in particular, let's say blue collar white workers in the Rust Belt seem to be voting for Biden at the same level as they voted for Obama in 2008, which is to say, they seem to be voting for him. But what I worry about this is that this Biden performance in 2020, these voters might be kind of dead cat bounce. I hate that metaphor. I don't know why I used it, but in that the Democratic Party has been losing this base. Um, Biden is a politician that has a lot of familiarity with these areas, and even though he's a Democratic Party hack, in my opinion, he's a Democratic Party hack who's had a lot of experience talking in union halls and talking to these voters, just by virtue of the fact that he's been a senator since 1972, and that used to be much more so than even today the base of the Democratic Party. But I worry whether after Biden, just back to increase the alignment, then the Democratic Party becoming a coalition between progressive minded people who are a smattering of people across all classes, um, plus these suburban voters, if that makes sense, these wealthier suburban voters. In which case, then it starts to resemble a party that I'm trying to think of a corollary overseas. I guess like the British Liberals or some Green parties, mainstream Green parties in Europe, where it doesn't actually have a base, and there's nothing really making it a party of redistribution. It just becomes a party of progressive social values mixed with like broadly center right economics, then going up toe to toe with a maybe right populist Republican Party that is combining some vaguely redistributive economic programs, which of course don't really challenge capital, with more conservative social values. And that to me seems like the future of American politics unless the Sanders coalition finds a way to actually take power from the mainstream establishment Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you, except there. I hold out. I put it this way: I hold out hope for one thing in lieu of that, which is that. And to be clear, I'm not hoping that things get worse before they get better. I'm not hoping for that, but I'm actually, in some ways, predicting that, which relates to this in the following way: that when you have so much wealth concentrated in so few hands, where even the difference between being in the top 1% or the top 0.5% is so vast, which it really actually is. If you look at the inequality curve, it doesn't sort of go like this. It goes like this, right? Where it's like the difference between being in the top 1% versus the top 0.5% is like enormous, right? I mean, I think top 1% is, don't quote me on this, but it's something along the lines of your household income is like $300,000 or $400,000 a year, which of course is a lot. That's top 1%. Top 0.5% is like in the millions, right? Like, so my point in saying that is that I don't think it's a 99% versus 1% situation. I think it's like a 99.8% versus 0.2% situation when it comes to economic inequality in this country. And I do think that means that even upper middle class people, considered somewhat affluent, feel many, certainly not at the same level, but do feel many of the same economic insecurities that people lower down the income ladder feel. And again, I'm not saying that they're facing those challenges as acutely, but as an example, the reason in the short term the Affordable Care Act's specific pre-existing condition protections are so politically viable, and I want to underscore in the short term, we can talk about the long term. The reason it's so important in the short term, politically powerful in the short term, is because everybody, unless you're like a true millionaire, like really, really wealthy, you really need and want pre-existing conditions protected. And so the point is, whether you're poor or whether you're all the way up to pretty affluent, those are important to you. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is that the economic crises have gotten so acute that they even affect middle and upper middle class people. Now, I definitely agree with you that a Democratic Party and a political coalition is weaker if it is a coalition that's focused mostly on middle and upper middle class people and doesn't have a strong working class component. I totally agree with you on that. I'm just saying I think that the crises have gotten so bad that there are still places, there are new areas of potential consensus. Medicare for all is a good example because nobody, very few people like the health insurance companies, and lots of people, unless you're like a truly super rich person, you probably need health insurance. And so that's one example. Same thing, by the way, climate change is a good example too. Climate change affects us all. Unless you're like a super rich person who can buy a luxury bunker, like climate change is probably somewhat scary to you if you're a rational person and not a climate denier. Which,
And I guess part of the key is that we actually have to win some games in order to cement these coalitions. So right now, to be a Bernie is a very ideological thing, right? It's rooted in believing in a candidate, believing in a set of ideas. But in the future, to be a Bernie-crat, if it actually has a mass movement permanently behind it, a base permanently behind it, it will mean to be someone who might have benefited from Medicare for All, who might have benefited from some sort of big piece of pro-worker legislation, to actually win on those bread and butter issues and see a constituency grow out of that. I mean, we saw with FDR and the New Deal, to bring it up again, the total realignment of American politics, in part because there was a hell of a lot of people who saw material benefits and wanted to hold on to those gains, and they organized politically to do so. So, I want to actually just get to a couple quick other things before we wrap up, because so first of all, I always ask very serious lefty friends these questions, and they get very annoyed, because I just actually enjoy horse race questions, and I'm always willing to put out my totally ridiculous and often bunk theories about what's going to happen. But I'm feeling very optimistic about Tuesday, in the sense that I think that, one, it looks like it's going to be a historic election as far as turnout. I'm not so certain about Arizona. I'm not so certain about, I'm definitely not certain about Texas and Georgia. But it seems to me that between Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Biden seems to be in pretty good shape. And, yeah, I'm feeling much more confident than I was a month ago. And I'm just wondering whether you'll put it out there, because this video will unfortunately stay archived after Tuesday. What you think about Tuesday, and also just in general, what you think about how Biden has run his campaign. It seems to me that his program is still incredibly frustrating to me, but he's definitely run a better campaign than Clinton run rhetorically and otherwise in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like making predictions, because frankly, I'm not a pollster. And I think that armchair predictions based on public polling. I mean, one thing, if you've worked on campaigns, which if you're looking at my T-shirt here, you know that I have worked on campaigns and continue to be a supporter of a campaign. This is my wife's campaign. She's a state legislator here in Colorado. Is that you understand the difference between private polling and public polling? That public polling is really it's just hard to know quality control. So that's why I don't like making like specific predictions. What I will say is that Donald Trump faces historic political headwinds, in the sense that there's literally a global pandemic that he botched, and that many people understand that he botched. The economy is in deep crisis for millions of people. There's a massive healthcare crisis. Millions of people have lost their healthcare, which of course is related to the economic crisis. And it's hard to win re-election as an incumbent when the election is a referendum on the incumbent in that kind of situation. That's on top of, that's the foundation. And in addition, Donald Trump's antics, his attack on core democratic institutions, which I do actually think. I mean, my view on Donald Trump is he the worst? Is he not the worst? I think it's kind of a silly argument, because George W. Bush was an absolutely horrifyingly terrible president who now, because he's friends with Ellen, everyone likes him now, apparently, or a lot of people like him, which is sad and pathetic. So the whole like who's the worst president versus who's not the worst president, I think that Donald Trump, when it comes to the assault on voting rights and the like, is simply an extension of what the Republican Party has been. And that the effort to pretend that that's not true is an effort by Republican operatives, people like at the Lincoln Project, to pretend they had nothing to do with actually creating Donald Trump and the conditions that brought about Donald Trump, because they are grifters who want to basically exist in a post-Trump world and make millions of dollars in a post-Trump world. I think that where Donald Trump is different is that Donald Trump wakes up, and we've written this, is that Donald Trump wakes up every day trying to incite. Donald Trump wakes up every day trying to sow anxiety. Donald Trump wakes up every day actively trying to destabilize, psychologically destabilize the country. And as horrific as George Bush and Dick Cheney were, and I think you can make an argument on the merits of the policies that Dick Cheney and George Bush was the worst administration in history, and as bad, if not worse, than Trump. I think that's a debatable argument to have. I do not think that they woke up every day trying to psychologically destabilize the country and incite every single day of their presidency. And that doesn't mean they're better people or they're nicer people or they're more moral people. It just means that is what truly is different about Donald Trump. And that has a real psychological effect. And frankly, it's going to have a real psychological effect on this country for years to come, whether Trump wins or loses. It is, in a sense, there's going to be mass PTSD. He has sown the seeds of things that you can't just, repeal after a presidential election. And we're talking about, extremism, sort of hate crimes, all of that horrible stuff he has unleashed by doing this. So all of that's to say is that I do think so there's a potential rejection of that in the election, on top of those foundational issues of like the economy being bad and the pandemic. So I would be surprised. That's a long way of saying I would be very surprised if he is nonetheless able to win. Now, I know people have said, there's voter suppression and all that, and there is. And the cases in court, try to stop the vote or halt the vote, that's all real. The way I look at that is that, there's an old adage on campaigns that if you have the best field operation you can have, you may be able to wring 3 to 5 points. You may be able to swing like on top of everything else. Forget about TV ads, forget about how good or bad your candidate is. If you have a great field operation, door knocking operation, phone calls, texts, et cetera, you may be able to move the needle, no matter what, by 5%, 3 to 5%. I think voter suppression and these court cases, there's a similar dynamic. I think it can move the needle a little bit, but I would be surprised if this election is super, super close. Maybe it will be in the Electoral College, but in the vote, it really shouldn't be close. And I want to add one thing. If it is close, it is a complete referendum on the way that the Democrats ran the campaign. Now, I am with you. I think Biden ran a relatively shrewd campaign in the sense that it's not hard to run a relatively shrewd campaign in this environment, right? I mean, Donald Trump is screwing up everything. 3/4 of the battle to let him just sort of stand back as he botches everything, and then weigh in a very narrow way about about the most popular things that he's botching. Right? It's not that hard, and you can't even travel around because of the pandemic, so it's harder to get caught on camera or on mic saying something stupid. So it's not that hard to run that kind of a campaign. But if they nonetheless lose in this environment, I think the lesson is that they didn't activate enough people. They didn't that playing it safe didn't activate enough people. Now, I do think that when you mentioned Clinton, what's the difference between Clinton and Biden? I think, and I'm not making a value judgment on this, to be clear, because Joe Biden has a pretty horrific public record that I've written about a lot. And I don't want to debate is he better or worse than Hillary Clinton? But fair or unfair, and maybe it was sexism, maybe it's other things. Hillary Clinton was in some ways uniquely despised by a certain subset of the population, and that does not as much despise Joe Biden. Again, maybe that's fair, maybe it's not fair, but I think that's the advantage if you want to compare the Clinton campaign with the Biden campaign, that's the advantage that one of the advantages that Joe Biden has. If you just rerun the 2016 campaign with somebody, a candidate who isn't as well hated, as intensely as Hillary Clinton, then you're going to win.
So you heard it here, folks. David Sirota guarantees a Biden victory on Tuesday.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so we both have to go in like 4 minutes, but I just want to end on one other note. Obviously, I avoid the buzziness. I don't want to talk about Glenn Greenwald or censorship or in the way it's been discussed or whatnot. But I did want to bring up one thing that's been troubling me as an editor and as a journalist, which is that to me, it seems like there's not enough attention on the left, or there's been a sidestepping of how to deal with the influence of these big tech companies on our discourse. And if anything, we've seen people who are great allies of what we're doing. People like AOC, I think, get on the side of demanding more interventions from these tech companies instead of questioning their power. So particularly, I wanted to ask you about how Twitter and other social media companies handled the Hunter Biden story in New York Post. Mind you, I dislike Joe Biden for many other reasons, but I think the story is quite weak. But a lot of the stuff that's been said about the story, about it being misinformation or a foreign campaign, seems to me also incorrect. But beyond that, I mean, it is kind of shocking that the New York Post, which is third or fourth, it's in the top five circulation publication in the country, has had access to its Twitter. So obviously, they could probably have resolved this with Twitter if they didn't want to just turn this into a big campaign. But the idea that a social media company could cut off those avenues, to me, is really shocking and scares me a bit as someone who publishes quite polarizing material from the other side of the political spectrum. And I'm just wondering how you think we should handle that, and whether the left should be, if not coming to the New York Post defense, which for those of you not paying attention, it's a right wing paper that publishes a lot of trash, but it's still a large paper. But yeah, so I just wanted to ask you about that last question of journalism and censorship.
I mean, my view is that I think there's two issues. I mean, one, on the Hunter Biden story itself, I think journalism organizations need to make choices. I'll put it this way: journalism organizations make choices through various metrics and various matrices. Is the story factually sound? And frankly, I mean, they're like, if you think journalism organizations don't have viewpoints, let's put it that way, political viewpoints and the like, then you're crazy. I think that. So I think my view on the Hunter Biden story is that it's a relatively weak story. It deserves the coverage of a weak, but certainly, I guess, politically significant story that doesn't need to be blown up all over the place like Hillary Clinton's emails and the like. I mean, I do think there is a legitimate criticism of the media back in the Hillary Clinton emails thing, blowing that up into some huge story that it didn't deserve to be so big a story. But so there's like, how newsworthy is the Hunter Biden story from a journalism perspective? That's one question. The separate question is, should tech platforms, be making news judgments on top of news organizations and to essentially censor information that a news organization or an individual has decided to put out there? I think there are very clear reasons to do that in specific cases. Personal harassment, threats of violence, all that stuff, right? You don't want Nazi. If you don't have to allow Nazis.
Direct incitement.
Yeah, exactly, right. But when a platform uses its power as a platform to effectively make a news decision, a journalism decision, to set, whether be, and in part because of their not because what was put out there was factually inaccurate, and they could thus be held liable for libel. But because they don't like the interpretation of it, they don't like the potential political ramifications of that information being out there. They're afraid that people will consider it too important. You consider a weak news story as a big news story. That's where I think the danger really lies. And the last thing I'll say on this, because I got to run in a sec, is that the main thing is that the platforms cannot simultaneously argue that they are content agnostic and therefore not legally responsible for the content that's being put on their platform, and then periodically weigh in to take things off of their platform in the name of political ideology or the idea that they don't like political ramifications. They can't. It's one or the other, and that's really the issue here.
So I think that's a great place to end it. My perspective is, direct incitement and other things that violate laws. Like, yes, any platform would have to remove that material, but it's very dangerous to just think that these media companies with independent fact checkers can wield this much power. Because, by the way, for those of you who aren't in journalism, it's just kind of common sense that an outsider can actually fact check a piece as well as the venue that produced the piece, because a lot of it's based on original investigative research and sources and whatnot. But thank you so much for your time, David. Everyone, please check out the Daily Poster, subscribe to it. It's David Sirota's newsletter that has a host of very talented journalists around him. They've been doing stuff that we've been syndicating on the Jacobin site. And please tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for another episode of Weekends with Anna and Nando and guest Adolph Reed. Thank you so much. Press like, subscribe. Thanks to Cale
Thanks
Brooks.
For having me.
And,
appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll talk to you soon. I'll see you soon.
All right.